Hello and welcome to another episode of V's Perspective. In this episode, we'll talk about what's happening in Europe and European continent in terms of countries repositioning themselves vis-a-vis the transatlantic ties as well as the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. You had the UK leader Keir Starmer announcing that Britain is entering a phase of war preparedness. What that means is really a repositioning in terms of strategic posture in Europe, also combining its capacities with other countries, for example, other countries which align with Ukraine, for example, France, Germany. Talking of Germany, you have Friedrich Merz, who has recently allowed long range missiles, particularly Taurus missiles, to be positioned inside Ukraine, which means, and has also announced that along with the UK, US, and, and France, the countries that are backing Ukraine have removed any range limitations on arms and ammunition being supplied to Ukraine. And that really catapults this conflict in a new trajectory, in a new orbit in terms of how Russia is going to respond to all this. Now, all of this comes with the background of the second round of talks that just ended in Istanbul. Um, without the details of the talks are not yet out, but it lasted about an hour, which means that the negotiations are still in the early phase. And remember that coming from the last negotiations, the terms of the last negotiations are still not completed. For example, the POW exchange, the prisoners of war exchange, has only gone that far in terms of roughly around 300 odd prisoners being exchanged from either side, or a number like that, which means that there are certain steps still pending from the first talks. But the fact that the two sides could meet and talk again is a positive sign. Now, this is happening in the background with the background of the recent apparent attack deep inside Russian territory by Ukraine, using methods which are clearly reflective of a new kind of war that is being fought, not just in Europe, but I think across the world, where technology and particularly drone technology is being used in a new way to gain upper hand vis-a-vis your opponent. And I think what that there are certain decisions that now catapults this war in a new in a new orbit. One is that this war certainly places a lot of pressure on Vladimir Putin and Russia to be able to come to the negotiating table. But for Russia as a great power to eat the word, to sort of eat the words of a great power standpoint, which is that a great power, it's very difficult for a great power to really sit at the table um, and talk about and agree to some kind of pressure from a country, especially from a country which is weaker in terms of power assessment, capability assessment, and so on and so forth. So, and which is why you often hear Donald Trump saying that Vladimir Putin from Russia is tapping me along. What that really means is the appetite for Russia to sit at the negotiating table is something that will not so much be decided by externalities, but by Russia's own will. And I think, only great powers show that kind of uh, that kind of um, pressure to hold out to pressures international pressures from other countries. It's signaling, and second, it's also speaking of capacity. It's reflective of how much strength still is left with the state to be able to go into a long drawn conflict. Now remember that this conflict is already gone for three and a half years, closing on 4 years. And I think that the idea that externalities and external pressure can really corner um, large states like Russia to a negotiating table is something that states don't um, take well take well into their strides. And therefore, the fact that Russia is still willing to talk to Ukraine is reflective of a couple of things. One is, of course, it's a long drawn conflict. Both sides are fatigued, and both sides want to come to the table. Um, the second is, of course, the pressure from the United States. I think the United States communicated from both sides continuously, tried to bring this uh, bring this uh, conflict to a halt. But I think little did Trump realize before jumping the gun on announcing that he will resolve this conflict. That conflict resolution is a difficult task in international politics, and that's simply out there for all states that have witnessed conflicts, and even those that haven't witnessed conflict, for them to see. So conflict resolution is something that is really entangled in state politics, and therefore um, it's entangled with the question of capability, with the question of reputation, with the question of state power, and with the question of power projection. I think all of these combine together to compel states into being into solidly being on one position when they are particularly in a war. So the second aspect is, of course, the external pressure. The third is that uh, the how much of the repercussions going to follow? How much are the repercussions if are going to follow if Russia is not going to sit at the table and talk about resolution of this conflict? Remember that um, this is a conflict that, and this is a negotiation that is only being talked about a 30-day ceasefire or a 60-day ceasefire. So it's not a talk which is going to last, uh, which is going to deliver a permanent ceasefire. So it's still advantage Russia in terms of where they want to go with the 60 or a 30-day deadline of a ceasefire. So the third aspect that comes to my mind is in that is in play in the dynamic between Russia and Ukraine is the fact that Russia is also concerned about the secondary sanctions. Remember that there were two congressmen that have recently gone to Europe, including Blumenthal and Lindsey Graham. Both of them have proposed to the Congress about secondary sanctions, and if secondary sanctions come in, I mean they've quoted a wild number as high as 500%, but I don't think that's possible or feasible. But let's assume that a secondary sanction kicks in, and Russia decides to hold out from sitting at the table in the third after the second round of talks. Countries across the world, supply chains across the world, and it's particularly energy supply chains across the world will be impacted, including countries like India and China, which are great importers, major importers of energy from Russia. So, but more than countries which will be impacted, I think it'll be Russia's economy, which will also be impacted, because remember that all throughout the war, the energy dependence on Russia, uh, the energy dependence of Russia has really churned the economy in a certain way. So that is critical. And finally, I think the factor that is responsible here is also the fact that um, you know you have a certain unpredictability in the larger in the broader world, including the Middle East, and this war has prevented Russia uh, from going into areas that it otherwise could comfortably go in. For example, in Africa with the Wagner Group, while these presence continues in some form or the other. But I think as power projection, for example, in Syria, as you see, when the Assad regime fell, the ability of Russia to be able to consolidate its position in these regions will depend a lot on how soon this conflict is resolved, um, and what comes after that in terms of what it wants to do with state with power and capability and its economy abroad. Finally, I think the recent attacks inside Russia is again is again likely to sort of unfold in two ways. One is you're going to see a strong Russian retaliation, which is, of course, for which I think most analysts will expect. And the second is the fact that um, you know holding out on the negotiations is going to be a strategy that could be prolonged. Therefore, where does Ukraine go with this is really difficult to see. I mean, they're on one hand trying to put together a coalition of sorts within Ukraine, within Europe, but the ability of that composition to really hold out against Russia will be tested very, very strongly. Let me stop here. Thank you.